Okay, so our next set of notes is about Andrew Jackson. That is the guy on the $20 bill, if you're lucky enough to have one. And it is America's 7th president. So, a little bit of background about Andrew Jackson is that he was born to a very poor family in a small cabin somewhere in Tennessee, North South Carolina, somewhere in that area. Back then, that was considered the West, so he was really our first president from the West, not from one of the states that borders the coast. He became famous when he defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812 that we talked about at the end of our last set of notes. And he was a slave owner, believed that government should play a very small role, much like his idol, Thomas Jefferson. Jackson runs for president in 1824 against John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams would be our second president's son, so he's the son of John Adams. Now, it's a very, very close race that ends in kind of a backroom deal that Andrew Jackson calls the corrupt bargain. But Adams has an unsuccessful presidency with many policies that prove to be very unpopular, much like his father. In 1828, the pair runs against each other again, and this time, things get ugly. Now, before we go into the campaign, I'm going to show you a quick little video of John Quincy Adams' presidency and how that turned out for him.
Ladies and gentlemen, get ready for a brawl like nothing America has seen before. The election of 1824. In this corner, at 5'7", from Harvard University, son of our second president, author of the Monroe Doctrine, and cranky in 7 languages, John Quincy Adams. And in this corner, he's rough, he's tough. He was born in a log cabin and never went to college. Winner of more than a dozen duels, he's the hero of the War of 1812. Old Hickory himself, Andrew Jackson.
Unfortunately for Jackson, there were candidates in the other 2 corners as well. Jackson got the most votes, but he didn't win the presidency. To win the presidency, the Constitution required that he win at least half the vote. But with 4 candidates this time, no one had won half the vote. The House of Representatives, led by Henry Clay, acted as referee, and Adams was declared the winner. Why? Well, Adams promised to make Henry Clay his Secretary of State, and in return, Clay gave his support to Adams, tipping the scales in Adams' favor. At that time, being Secretary of State pretty much meant you'd end up being president soon. Sweet deal for Clay, right? You heard of President Clay? No. Sorry, Clay. But President Adams was happy, and he was a go-getter, up every morning at 5 a.m. reading from the Bible. Then before work, he'd take a walk, or was even known to swim naked in the Potomac. Adams was formal and proper, and seemed more like a Bible-reading guy than a skinny-dipping guy. He also seemed like a guy who could get stuff done as president. So much for appearances. 2 people stood in his way. Andrew Jackson, who thought Adams had stolen the election in a corrupt bargain with Clay. And well, Adams himself. He was so self-righteous, stubborn, and irritable that even some of his friends didn't support his plans. Adams famously said,
"The 4 most miserable years of my life were my 4 years in the presidency."
Fortunately for Adams, he lost the presidency in 1828. And went on to enjoy a career in the House of Representatives.
John Quincy Adams was a great thinker and diplomat and a great congressman. He was not good at persuading people, bringing them over to his side, which is what a president needs to do oftentimes.
As president, he may not have been a lover or a fighter, but in the end, he turned out to be a dedicated public servant and a guy who really liked to skinny dip.
Mr. President, good heavens!
Okay, so this really kind of nasty election between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson has a lot of firsts. It's the first time that they use campaign buttons in large circulation. It's the first time you see large political rallies and even election slogans. They wanted to appeal to as many voters as possible. mudslinging comes about, or real negative campaigns. Now, those were used beforehand, for example, with John Adams and Jefferson, but never to the extent that we see them here. Adams attacks Jefferson's character and even calls his wife some offensive names. Jackson accused Adams of being uptight and out of touch with the public. Let's see. So, what did Jackson call the election of John Quincy Adams in 1824? Did he call it nonsense? Did he call it illegal? Did he call it a corrupt bargain? Did he call it unfair dealings? And we can see here that the answer is C, the corrupt bargain. Okay, so Jackson was extremely popular among the common man because of his upbringing and his personal success. He gave most voters a real sense of hope. And you can see that in the 1828 election, this time Andrew Jackson wins in a landslide. The yellow states here are the ones that voted for Jackson. The purple, the more in the Northeast where he's from, they're the only ones that voted for John Quincy Adams. Jackson institutes this thing called the spoils system. In this system, he replaces government officials with his good friends and his supporters. So instead of having the job go to people that are the most capable, instead they end up going to people that he just likes and is friends with. So his cabinet is nicknamed the kitchen cabinet because they were rumored that they entered the White House through the kitchen door. Generally, guys, if you enter someone's house through the back door, you usually know them very, very well. If you didn't know them very well, you enter through the front door. So that's kind of where the little play on words for the kitchen cabinet came from. Okay, which is not a reason for Andrew Jackson's win in 1828. Was it the people hated John Quincy Adams, he was very popular among the common man, or he appealed to the wealthy? Okay, we see here that the answer is C, because he does not appeal to the wealthy, he appeals more to the common man. Okay, the Indian Removal Act. This is by far Andrew Jackson's most controversial decision while in office. Really what ends up happening is that a lot of these farmers that supported Jackson, they wanted to have the land that was occupied out west by some Native Americans. So Congress passed and Jackson approves the Indian Removal Act of 1830. What that does is the U.S. is going to pay all Native American tribes living east of the Mississippi to move to a shared reservation that is in present-day Kansas and Oklahoma. The problem, though, is that most Indians don't really want to live out in that reservation that we'll get to in a second, which is not a term that's used to describe appointing friends to government positions. It's a kitchen cabinet, friendly entry, spoil system. And the answer here is B, because it does apply to both A and C. Okay, so here's a little map of the affected Indian tribes. You have the Cherokee, the Creek Indians, the Chickasaw and the Choctaw Indians, and you also have the Seminole Indians that lived right here locally in Central Florida. And this is just the path they took to this yellow area here, which was this new reserved Indian land. So if you can see, Seminoles, who really had nothing culturally similar to, Chickasaw Indians way up here, are now going to be neighbors when it comes up to this new territory here. This is a huge adjustment, and obviously these Native American tribes are not going to be happy with this. So, of course, they resist. The U.S. military forces a lot of them to leave at gunpoint. So what they end up doing is going on this large march, right? That's a military campaign for the most part, but a lot of Native Americans die on their journey to the new land. And thus this whole Indian Removal Act becomes known as the Trail of Tears. Now, some tribes tried to fight the army using force. Interestingly enough, one tribe, the Cherokee, actually decided to fight the act in court. The court made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the Cherokee and said, you know what, that is your land, you don't have to move. But Andrew Jackson, being stubborn as he was, said, well, the Supreme Court doesn't have an army to enforce this decision, and I as president do, so I'm just going to ignore what the Supreme Court decides. Also, I skipped this up here. The Seminole Indians right here in Central Florida do fight a semi-successful war with the American military, but in the end, a majority of them are forced out as well. Okay, the last big aspect with Andrew Jackson is the bank. Andrew Jackson feels that the Bank of the United States supports the wealthy and does nothing but keep the wealthy rich and keeps the common man poor. So he thought the bank's officials were corrupt and really wanted to shut it down. He placed the nation's money into small state banks, but what ends up happening is that this move of his proves to be completely disastrous, and the country suffers from a huge economic depression as a result. Which of the following was not part of the tribe was not part of the Trail of Tears? The Creek, the Seminoles, the Cherokee, or the Iroquois? And the answer here is D, Iroquois. Okay, here's another quick video. This one is from the same makers as that made the previous video, and this one is about Jackson's presidency.
Up until 1829, all of our presidents have been aristocratic, dignified, educated, and presidential. And then came Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson represented America's common man. And by that, we mean he was a man who commonly looked for a fight wherever he could. He fought in the Revolutionary War when he was 13. He fought in the War of 1812. He invaded Florida in 1818, and he still found time to get into plenty of duels, getting shot 3 times for his efforts.
Is that all you got?
Thomas Jefferson said,
I feel much alarmed at the prospect of seeing General Jackson president. He is one of the most unfit men I know for such a place.
But many Americans thought a common man like Jackson would best represent their wishes for America's future. The election of 1828 was a rematch between Fancy Pants John Quincy Adams and regular Guy Jackson. And things got ugly fast. Adams called Jackson
A barbarian who could hardly spell his own name.
Jackson replied,
It is a damn poor mind indeed, which can't think of at least 2 ways to spell any word.
apparently there's only one way to spell loser because Adams was defeated. And Jackson became president. Jackson said no to any legislation that expanded the federal government or that he thought did not benefit the common man. This philosophy became known as Jacksonian democracy.
The democracy that he created, the democratic process that he created, and the Democratic Party that he created put the people really in the middle of everything. And we are the children of that very system.
The trouble was that Jackson's definition of a common man was, well, usually a white guy who had a lot in common with him. Even though the Supreme Court had ruled in favor of Cherokee rights, Jackson authorized the Indian Removal Act, forcing tens of thousands of Native Americans to leave their land. Jackson was also a strong supporter of states' rights, in theory. But when the citizens of South Carolina refused to follow federal laws on tariffs because they saw the tariffs as unfair, Jackson immediately threatened to hang their leader, his own vice president, John Calhoun. Ouch!
Andrew Jackson is an interesting example of a figure becoming president. He's a military figure who rises to the office and has to deal with a number of different issues. A very contentious Congress and a lot of fights between him and the Congress over who should really run the government.
Jackson's biggest fight was with the Second Bank of the United States.
Jackson and his associates thought that this was a monopoly, that this was run by rich people for rich people, and that it should be destroyed.
Jackson was sick one night in the White House, and his vice president came by to see him, Martin Van Buren, and Van Buren looked at him with great concern because Jackson looked so sick, and Jackson roared up and said, "The bank is trying to kill me, Mr. Van Buren, but I will kill it." And he did.
To the dismay of Congress, which supported the bank. Andrew Jackson had strong opinions and was always fighting. Sometimes because he just liked to fight, but usually because he was fighting for a better America.
Okay, so which is not a reason that Jackson thought the bank should be shut down? Was it because it was located in the north, because it had corrupt leaders, or that it only supported the rich? And the answer here is A, because it was located in the north, which it was, but that's not one of the reasons why he cites for it being shut down. So, Jackson's legacy. He's remembered with kind of mixed reviews. Some say he was a hero, that he expanded democracy, and that he fought for the common man. Others say that he was oppressive, war-hungry, and tyrannical. So, your reflection for this set of notes is, what do you think? So I want you to go ahead and at the bottom answer that in your reflection. Tell me, what do you think Andrew Jackson should be remembered as? Should he be remembered as a hero or a villain, and why? Also, don't forget the margins, and we'll see you next time.